following is a CUNY TV special presentation.
Earlier this year, ABNY conducted a survey with our members to find out what we should be prioritizing, as I said before, as we head into a new era of, with a new mayor and speaker and council members and borough presidents. It is definitely a time of transition and makes ABNY's involvement in the direction of the city and other organizations that speak for job creation, education, crime reduction, urbanism. Those are the things that we focus on. And during this survey, it came back loud and clear that education was the top priority. So it is with the new school year starting literally today. I walked out of my building and there are all the kids heading off to school. My granddaughter, who's just 1, she'll be doing that in a few years. So obviously, education means so much to all of us, and that is why we are honored to have with us the Chancellor of the Department of Education, Dennis Walcott. Dennis, we look forward to hearing about your progress regarding the Common Core and your thoughts about the future of public education. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our good friend, Chancellor Dennis Walcott.
Good morning to all of you, and thank you, Bill. It is an honor to be invited and to speak to all of you once again. Next Monday for the New York City Department of Education marks the first day of school, and it'll be the 12th and final opening of the school year for this administration, and I want to use this moment to talk about the future of our great public school system. This past spring, I was at a school in Lower Manhattan, and I was charging basically the students to continue reading over the summer. It was funny, it was a group of second graders. We were talking about summer reading loss and making sure that the students continue to read, and I asked one of the students who was second grade, I said, do you know what a chancellor is? And Ernie and folks would appreciate this. And this second grader actually said, the chancellor is the principal of all of our principals. And I said, that's pretty deep. I'm going to have to use that on a regular basis. And so, you know, I stand here today as the principal of all of our principals. And when I challenged them, you know, I said to myself, you know, I'm going to really have to take my own advice and continue to read over the summer. So I finished the book on Lincoln, and it was extremely enjoyable. And then I decided to read Crime and Punishment. And then I started to read Crime and Punishment, and then it was like a flashback. You know, I was going back to my teenage years, and I quickly put that book down. I said, it's like a crime and a punishment for me to try to read that book, so I put that book down. And then a friend recommended a book that I knew of, but I really hadn't read before, The Ungovernable City by Vincent Canotto, an extraordinary account of New York during the Lindsay years. And the more and more I got into the book, the more and more I enjoyed it, and it was just fascinating. And as you can imagine, I really got wrapped up in the sections dealing with the public school system back in the 1960s and the 1970s. And as you may know, for those who read the book paints a picture of a system spiraling out of control. In 1970, the New York Times described our public schools as plagued by chaos and disorder, in which quoted saying, thugs engaged in widespread intimidation, shakedowns, extortion, and violent assault. And Ernie is nodding his head because he was a principal and eventually in some of those schools back then. There was bedlam in many of the schools back then. At Samuel J. Tilden High School in Brooklyn in 1969, 2,000 students had to be evacuated after a student threw a Molotov cocktail through a window. 1 year later, the school was closed again when students set off stink bombs in the cafeteria and assaulted police officers. Mr. Canotto cites drama teacher's written account of life at Junior High School 275 in Brownsville, and quoting, the stairwells were marred by splashes of paint on the walls, litter spilled down the stairs illuminated by broken light fixtures, char marks indicated where fires had been set, the odor of urine hung over the corridors, and sometimes we inhaled mace sprayed by hostile students. Teachers reported senseless, violent confrontations with students. In retrospect, it's hard to believe how long New Yorkers put up with such unconscionable situation, because rather than the chaos abating with the end of the 1960s, the schools were only beginning their nosedive. In 1986, the Board of Education began to keep statistics on its graduation rates. And as a result of that, we found that fewer than half of the city's students were graduating in 4 years. For the following 15 years, that number barely budged. It stayed around 49, 50%. And in 2002, just before we stepped in, nearly a quarter of our kids were dropping out. 30 years after the riots in the cafeteria at Tilden High School was still enduring a culture of violence and academic failure. Many students were regularly arming themselves with guns and knives, and the graduation rate at that school was 43%. The story was the same for Erasmus, where the graduation rate was 32%, and at Morris High School, where it was 31%. At Adlai Stevenson High School in the Bronx, gang fights in the late 1990s were so common that teachers regularly pulled down iron gates from the hallway ceilings to contain the rioting. The only way to protect students and staff was to make them prisoners in their own schools. Not surprisingly, the school was steeped in failure in other ways as well. Only 1 in 3 students there graduated on time, if at all. Think of the students who were forced to attend these schools. They had no other alternative other than walking through dangerous hallways. No choice but to endure what was likely an inferior education, judging by the numbers. Their parents had little objective information about how their school was performing, little way of judging how qualified the teachers were. They couldn't be sure if the school administrators were there because of their qualification or because of patronage deals struck by community school board members. And even if they had known this information, a maze of union contracts and Byzantine laws and regulations would have prevented them from doing anything about it. They were all but prohibited from sending their kids to high schools outside their districts. The gates were closed around them. Those parents and students didn't know there could be another way, because for decades there wasn't one. The forces of self-interest has made that a case to really live by during that period of time. Not because they didn't care about children, because they cared more about themselves, or the people who signed their paychecks, or the people who got them their jobs. It is especially worth reflecting on this during an election year, because whoever gets to decide the city's education agenda for the next 4 years had the best to recall how bad things once were, and how easy it would be to relive the disasters of the past. There are powerful adults whose control over our students' education was loosened because Mayor Michael Bloomberg became the mayor. They are now vying to regain their grip on the system. You know, it's not a secret. The candidates are not fighting to keep me. They're not debating my name. We're going to keep Dennis. He's going to stay around. We really want him to be there because we like him so much. So I've resolved the fact that I'll be leaving the system December 31st. And that's fine, because in all fairness to any individual who becomes the mayor, they should choose their own person to be the next chancellor. You know, it's weird because I get emails when the mayor and I appearing together, and rumors started yesterday that I was announcing my resignation yesterday because someone saw a Twitter account where the mayor was appearing with Dennis Walcott, along with the police commission and others, to announce our truancy initiative. And they thought they saw the mayor is announcing Dennis Walcott is leaving. So I'm not leaving until December 31st. But leaving December 31st and knowing this, I have nothing left to vie for except for the interests of my students. I have 1.1 million students that are part of my responsibility. And 2 of those 1.1 million students are my grandchildren who will be starting school on the 9th of September as well. So I want to make sure we are all aware of what is at stake. No critic, candidate, or union chief will be honest enough to say that they want to return to the system of the old status quo. How could you return to that system? They have rather obscured their motives under the cloak of good intentions with empty platitudes. But if you listen carefully, you will hear euphemisms for some, what I think are very bad ideas. Without fanfare, many candidates are supporting the return to geographic management of our schools. That is an obscure term used in the education world that masks something enormously detrimental, taking back the power that we have given to our principals. It's striking how little authority our principals were once given to run their own schools back then. The community school boards controlled much of the money the schools received and dictated to how those dollars were to be spent. The teachers union controlled the classrooms, hamstringing principals from hiring, firing, or even evaluating their own members. There are a lot of good people who served on community boards. I know a lot of them. They gave their time, their energy, and their resources, sometimes for very little in return. But overall, those boards were a disaster for our students. If I were to detail every case of a member who was arrested on corruption charges, we would be here having lunch together. The New York Times reported in 1996 that, quote, investigations in some districts have shown that teachers and principals are routinely approached for political contributions and kickbacks, unquote. You know, I was given a behind-the-scenes glimpse of one of these districts back in 1996, probably when Ernie and I first met each other, when then Chancellor Rudy Crew got fed up with what was happening with the mismanagement in District 5. And he then appointed me as an interim trustee after he fired the entire community school board. I was truly amazed at what I found. The district operation, which is basically a patronage bill, had squandered millions of dollars in education money while students were studying from out-of-date textbooks. The previous superintendent had been escorted out of a meeting after getting into a fistfight with one of the community members, and that was hardly the worst district in the city. Thanks to Mayor Bloomberg, those school boards are long gone. Most of their power had been placed in the hands of our school principals. We devolved unprecedented resources to the school level and gave principals authority to create their own budgets. Funding is based on students, what we call fair student funding, a common sense idea that is actually new and students with higher needs get higher funding. The Department of Education is spending a smaller % of its budget on central administration than ever before. We're not so much a school system anymore as much a system of schools. True to what critics say, there is no geographic management anymore. Our principals are the bosses of their building, and they can make the best decisions for their students. My job and my staff's job is simply to set the bar that the principals have to meet and set it high and help them meet it and do something about it if they don't. Our principals now get their support not from a powerful board or political figures, but from school networks staffed by educators and based around academic specialties. They are a far cry from the old districts. And as a result, we've made it exceedingly difficult for power brokers to place their cronies inside our schools anymore. There are no more community school board members to influence, strong arm, or bribe anyone. Ask yourself, who would benefit from taking power away from our principals, our 1 million students, or some of the special interests who are out there? The second red flag that we need to be aware of is the criticism of the so-called high-stakes testing. While the notion of reducing testing sounds appealing, the implications are rarely discussed. So let's discuss them. Despite the culture of failure that infected the schools over the year, the people who worked in them were barely held accountable for their school results. That was at least partially because there were virtually no measures of success or failure to judge them by. Prior to Mayor Bloomberg taking office, there were no yardsticks to measure which schools were working and which were failing, which ones improved over time and which ones declined, how each school performed compared with their peers. There were few objective measures of student performance. And as for their teachers, the United Federation of Teachers made sure it was next to impossible to evaluate their members' skills, much less take action if they were failing at their jobs. We built an accountability system that included qualitative reviews called progress reports, and we made the information available to the public. We abolished the absurd practice of promoting students to higher grades if they lacked the skills to succeed. And finally, we fought for and won just this year the first genuine teacher evaluation system in the history of the school system. In doing our research, when we were going back and forth with our respective union counterparts around the new evaluation system, we found a very interesting article, I think dated 1936, in the New York Times, talking about how the S&U system should be abolished. Now we will have a rigorous system in place to evaluate our teachers, and in working with the principals union to evaluate our leaders as well. On Monday, when the school year begins at our 1,819 schools, listen to that figure, 1,819 schools. When we started, it was roughly 1,200 schools. Principals will be, for the first time, begin evaluating teachers based on a common standard of effective teaching. We will continue to support our teachers with professional development and coaching, but if a teacher is deemed unsuited for the job, he or she can be removed from the classroom, something that was once impossible to conceive of. We want great teachers, and the majority of our teachers are fantastic at doing their jobs. But also for those teachers who cannot do their job without the support, they should not be in front of the classroom. We cannot, however, judge a teacher or a principal or a school without knowing whether their students are learning and whether their performance is improving or declining. No one likes taking tests, but tests are real. Tests are a part of our life. They are a critical part of setting standards and measuring one's ability to meet them. Views on standardized testing have been evolving over the years. School systems, ours included, continue to adjust how they're used. But their overall value is incalculable for measuring where our students are strong and where they are weak. We know that how students do in elementary and middle school is the strongest predictor of how they'll perform later on. So it's critical that we monitor their progress early on. Ask yourself this: if those arguing to the contrary this election year are interested in sparing our students the stress of exams or gutting an entire system of accountability, the teachers union, for example, will inevitably demand that the city and the state weaken the new system for evaluating their members. Whether the next leaders of our schools capitulate to that pressure will play a huge part in determining the future of our public schools. And finally, there's the issue of school choice, something that I believe in, something the mayor believes in, something that we have developed over the years. Unions, activists, and the candidates they support this year have been calling for moratoriums on replacing failing schools. How dare they? How dare they fail our students by calling for a moratorium on schools that are failing our students? Replacing failing schools with smaller schools and charters have worked, and they've worked over and over again. Some have called for, quote, community approval in the future before the Department of Education can act. Who could be against community approval? The question begs a larger one. What would have happened if that had been the policy all along? Those schools that I cited earlier in remarks would still be in existence. In 2002, the graduation rate at 22 of the city's large high schools was 38%. 38%. Some of them had graduation rates under 25% back then. Think about that, a 4-year graduation rate of under 25%. These schools had a culture of failure stretching back years and sometimes decades. They had defied a catalog of remediation strategies. They needed to be reconceived. Just imagine if we had a moratorium back then. We would be sentencing our students to failing schools for decades. And what we did is took action. After extensive community input and process approval by the Panel for Education Policy, we phased out each one and replaced them with a collection of small schools specializing in everything from architecture to zoology. Today, the culture at those 22 high school campuses has changed dramatically. That 38% average graduation rate of 2002 grew to 68% last year. Schools characterized by chaos and failure stretching back to the 60s have been reborn. At Erasmus, the graduation rate rose from 32% to 75%. At the Mars campus no longer has a 30% graduation rate. It doubled to 62%. At Tilden, the graduation rate rose from 42% in 2002 to 78% last year. And the dropout rate there at Tilden has dropped by half. And crime at Tilden is down 93%. Students at these schools are no longer there because they have to be there. They've chosen to attend. They have choice throughout the system. We've abolished the archaic school zoning rules that once trapped low-income students into the lowest performing schools in the city. We now offer high school students their choice of hundreds of schools in all 5 boroughs and have given them information about each school's performance. At schools across the city, we have raised the gates that once imprisoned our students. Last week, the MDRC, a widely respected national research group, released a study of our new small schools. It showed that the students who attend them have graduation rates 10 points higher than their peers at other schools. Better still, graduation rates for Black male students in these schools are almost 14 points higher at our small high schools. We have significantly reduced the racial achievement gap in our small schools. We have found a model for success that has eluded America's school systems for generations. Think of that when you hear someone call for community approval of school phase-outs, for limits on new charter schools, or for moratoriums on co-locating small schools in our buildings. How would you explain that to 60,000 charter school students, most of them from low-income families whose futures have been brightened? And any way you want to slice it, charter schools have been a spectacular success here. They consistently outperform their peer schools on state exams and any number of other barometers. As all of you may have heard me talk about, whether here at ABNY or other locations, I'm a big believer in choice, whether it's charter schools, small schools, single-sex schools, career technical education schools. We need to make sure we give choice and not close off choice to our communities. We have encountered angry opposition to almost every proposal we've made to phase out and revamp a failing school. But think about what would have happened if we hadn't done so. Who would have suffered more than our students? We never close a school except as a last resort. But what will happen in the future when that last resort is called for? It is critical that we not lose the courage to do what's right. As you may know, New York is in the midst of implementing the Common Core standards, probably the most significant change to classroom instruction in a generation. This spring, students in grades 3 through 8 took state tests for the first time based on these standards. When the results were released last month, there was a lot of predictable noise about how the test scores had dropped. No matter how often we explained that we had adopted tougher standards to prepare kids for college and careers, terms that never existed in the past. Yet beyond the politics were the signs of progress that were plain to see. The city students caught up to their peers across the state for the first time. Think about that. New York City students caught up with the state for the first time. And they outperformed students at every other major city in New York State by leaps and bounds. Of the state's top 25 schools, 22 of them are from New York City. 22 of the schools from New York City that are the top 25 from across the state. A decade ago, that number was 0. I've lived the modern history of the city's public schools as a public school student, as a parent, as the president of the Urban League, as a member of the city's Board of Education, as a deputy mayor for education, now as a grandparent, and now as a chancellor. And for a blink of an eye, if some of you remember who are really into the weeds, back in 2009, I also served as the temporary president of the Board of Education while I was deputy mayor, when mayoral control briefly expired. That gives me the distinction of having been the last Board of Education president in city history, and it should never be another one again. And I want to make sure we double lock that door behind me so no one can ever hold that job again. I know firsthand that public schools were once described as ungovernable, as the city itself, as Mr. Conato described so memorably. The old system seemed almost designed to hold few, if anyone, accountable for their failures. And we stepped forward. The mayor stepped forward and said, I want to be held accountable. The downward spiral only ended when Mayor Bloomberg fought to be held responsible for the performance. In the last decade, our graduation rate has risen by 40%. The school crime rate has fallen by 40%, and the dropout rate has been cut in half. We've halted a runaway train speeding down toward calamity. We have turned it around and reset it on a positive trajectory. We have laid the foundations, and as organizations like MDRC can attest to, that forward momentum is accelerating. But positive momentum is not the same thing as a mission accomplished. There are far too many students who are still not where they should be, and thanks to the familiar impediments, but also to our own failings, their experiments we launched that didn't work, the fights we waged but didn't win. While our schools have seen vast improvement, our middle schools are still lagging behind. And while Black and Latino students have shown improvement over the past few years, only a fraction are on track for college and careers. We have made progress on both fronts, but we still have far to go. This is a system that needs bold thinking and courage to carry out what needs to be done, not putting your finger in the wind and seeing which way the wind is blowing. What would happen if we had lost the fight to phase out and revamp Tilden High School? Where would those students be today? The next leaders of the school system will take over during a historic academic transition. The new Common Core standards represent the most promising change to classroom instruction in a generation. Handing back our students' fate to the city's special interests would be immoral. We need to give our students a fighting chance. Provide them with schools where they feel safe, where the teachers are supported and engaged, where a strong principal has the power to make decisions, where the standards are high, where students can pursue their most creative interests, be it in biology or technology, where they are not taught rote memorization, but how to analyze and think critically. My hope is that the next leaders of this great system build upon our efforts, take them to the next level. Turning back the clock would be a tragic mistake. No one knows this better than the people in this room, the business leaders, our educators, our community individuals who warned for years that the deterioration of the schools had been harming the city's economy. The future of New York City public schools looks bright this morning. Let's keep it moving forward. It would be a crime to lower the gates on our children again. Thank you very much.